15,000 years ago, Earth was a frozen world. Massive ice sheets, 2 miles thick, covered much of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels had plummeted 400 feet, exposing land that hadn't seen sunlight in millennia. And across one of these newly exposed landscapes, small bands of humans took their first steps into a world unknown to our species. This is the story of humanity's last great migration, the peopling of the Americas. A journey that would take brave pioneers from the frozen steppes of Siberia to the southern tip of South America in less than 2,000 years. Armed with nothing but stone tools and generations of survival knowledge, they would conquer 2 continents and encounter creatures that would soon vanish from the earth forever. This is the story of the first Americans. To understand this journey, we must first understand the world these people inhabited. Between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, Earth experienced what scientists call the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age. This was a planet transformed. The Laurentide ice sheet alone covered nearly all of Canada and the northern United States, containing enough ice to build a wall around the Earth's equator, 180 feet high. Global temperatures averaged 5 to 10 degrees Celsius colder than today. But the most dramatic change wasn't temperature. It was what happened to the oceans. So much water was locked in glacial ice that sea levels dropped approximately 400 feet. Imagine standing at the edge of what is now the Atlantic coast. You could walk 100 miles eastward before reaching water. This dramatic drop exposed Beringia, a landmass connecting Siberia to Alaska. But Beringia wasn't just a narrow land bridge that people simply walked across. It was a subcontinent, roughly the size of modern-day India, stretching over 1,000 miles from north to south. This was the doorway to the Americas. Beringia's landscape was unique, a cold, dry grassland called steppe tundra. Endless grasses and sedges stretched to the horizon, punctuated by patches of willow and dwarf birch. The wind never stopped. Temperatures in winter could plummet to -40 degrees Fahrenheit or colder. Yet this harsh environment supported an incredible array of life: woolly mammoths, steppe bison, horses, caribou, and the humans who hunted them. So, who were these people? The first to set foot in the Americas? They were us, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, with the same capacity for language, abstract thought, and innovation that we possess today. They had originated in Africa tens of thousands of years earlier, and their ancestors had been gradually spreading across Asia for millennia. These weren't explorers in the way we think of Columbus or Magellan. They weren't seeking new lands or planning expeditions. They were simply families. Small bands of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, extended families traveling together, grandparents who carried decades of survival knowledge, parents in their prime skilled in hunting and gathering, children learning the ways of their people. All of them adapted to life in the harshest climates on Earth. Imagine the knowledge required just to survive. They needed to understand animal behavior well enough to predict movements seasons in advance. They needed to identify dozens of plant species, which were edible, which medicinal, which poisonous. They needed to read weather patterns, find water sources, create fire in howling winds and sub-zero temperatures. Every member of the band carried information critical to survival. These were egalitarian societies, where leadership emerged from skill and experience rather than hereditary power. Resources were shared, decisions were made collectively. An injured or elderly member wasn't abandoned. They carried too much knowledge, too much value. In groups this small, everyone mattered. One person's knowledge of star navigation, another's skill at tracking, a third's ability to treat wounds, all were essential. The journey these people made wasn't intentional. No one woke up one morning and decided to discover America. Instead, they were following the same patterns their ancestors had followed for thousands of years. Tracking herds, following seasonal resources, moving a few miles here, a few miles there. Picture this. A band spots a herd of steppe bison moving eastward, following fresh spring grass. They follow, setting up camp a few miles from their last location. Months pass, the season changes. They move again, perhaps following mammoth tracks toward a distant water source. Year after year, generation after generation, this gradual drift continued. In a single lifetime, a person might travel only a few dozen miles from their birthplace. But over centuries, these small movements carried populations from Siberia, across Beringia, and into Alaska. The challenges were immense. Winter on Beringia meant temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Storms that lasted for days, with wind so strong it could knock a person down. Limited shelter materials. Few trees grew on the steppe tundra, so shelter meant hides stretched over frameworks of bone or the rare driftwood. Water, paradoxically, was scarce. Snow and ice had to be melted, requiring precious fuel. Yet they persisted. And scientists now believe this wasn't a single migration, but possibly several waves over thousands of years. Different groups at different times making that same gradual journey eastward. Some may have stopped in Beringia itself, living there for generations before moving on. Others may have turned back. But enough continued forward that by 15,000 years ago, humans had reached Alaska and were poised to enter the heart of the Americas. Reaching Alaska was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. Two massive ice sheets blocked the way south. The Laurentide ice sheet covering eastern and central North America, and the Cordilleran ice sheet blanketing the western mountains. Between them, nothing but ice. Thousands of feet thick, stretching from the Arctic Ocean to the northern United States. For thousands of years, the interior of North America was simply unreachable. But around 14,000 to 13,000 BCE, something changed. As global climate began its slow warming trend, a corridor opened between the two ice sheets, running along the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains through what is now Alberta and Montana. This ice-free corridor was narrow, perhaps 15 to 50 miles wide, a pathway flanked by walls of ice. For decades, archaeologists believed this was the route the first Americans took southward. But there's a problem with that theory. When the corridor first opened, it may have been ecologically barren. A strip of rock, gravel, and glacier meltwater with little vegetation and few animals. Could people really have walked this gauntlet, hundreds of miles, with limited food and resources?
That's why many scientists now favor a different route, the Pacific coast. As glaciers retreated, they exposed a coastal plain and ice-free refuges along the shore, and people could have traveled by boat, living on the ocean's abundance: fish, shellfish, seals, seabirds, kelp forests teeming with life. This kelp highway hypothesis suggests the first Americans were sophisticated mariners, not just land-based hunters. The evidence remains frustratingly elusive. Coastal sites from this period are now 200 feet underwater, submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Interior corridor sites are buried under Canadian forests or washed away by millennia of erosion. But one fact is undeniable. By 14,500 years ago, humans had reached Monte Verde and Chile, 10,000 miles from Alaska. However they did it, they moved fast.
The Americas that awaited these first humans were unlike anything on Earth today. This was a land of giants, megafauna that would seem impossible if we didn't have their bones to prove they existed. Woolly mammoths stood 11 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed 6 tons. Their tusks curved magnificently, some reaching 15 feet in length. They were everywhere, roaming in herds across the grasslands, their trumpeting calls echoing across the tundra. But mammoths were just the beginning. Mastodons, cousins to mammoths, browsed in the forests using their straighter tusks to strip bark from trees. Giant ground sloths, creatures that could reach 20 feet in length and weigh 4 tons, stood on their hind legs to feed from tree branches. Short-faced bears, the largest terrestrial carnivores ever to walk the earth, stood 12 feet tall when upright, with a bite force that could crush bone. Saber-toothed cats prowled with 7-inch canine teeth designed to deliver killing blows to thick-skinned prey. American lions, larger than their African cousins, hunted in prides. Dire wolves ran in packs, their massive jaws capable of crushing through the bones of prey. Giant beavers, the size of modern black bears, built dams in Ice Age rivers. And bison, not the bison we know today, but bison latifrons, stood 7 feet at the shoulder with horn spreads reaching 7 feet across. For these animals, humans were something new, predators unlike they'd encountered. They had no innate fear of these upright apes, and that lack of fear would prove fatal. Paleo-Indians hunted these giants using sophisticated strategies, targeting young or sick animals, using fire to drive herds towards cliffs or bogs, coordinating attacks by groups of hunters. A single mammoth provided 5 to 7 tons of meat, enough to feed a band for months if properly preserved. But this abundance came at tremendous risk. One mistake, one charge from a wounded mammoth, or a track by a protective mother could mean death. Then, quite suddenly in geological terms, they vanished. Within 2,000 years of human arrival in North America, most of these megafauna went extinct. The mammoth, the mastodon, the giant ground sloth, the saber-toothed cat, the short-faced bear. Gone. The debate continues. Did humans hunt them to extinction? Did climate change doom them as the Ice Age ended? Or was it a combination? The timing is damning. Wherever humans spread, extinctions followed. But we may never know the complete truth.
The technology that allowed Paleo-Indians to survive and thrive might look simple to modern eyes, sharp rocks and wooden spears. But that simplicity is deceptive. Behind these tools lay thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and skill. Stone tool making, knapping, is an art that requires years to master. A skilled napper can look at a piece of flint or obsidian and see the tool hidden within it, just as a sculptor sees the statue in the marble. They understand how stone fractures, how striking angle affects the flake, how to control the force of each blow. Using a hammerstone or antler billet, they strike the stone with precise force and angle, removing flakes to create an edge sharper than modern surgical steel. The most famous artifact from this period was the Clovis point. Named for the site in Clovis, New Mexico, where they were first discovered, these spear points are masterpieces of stoneworking. 2 to 6 inches long, symmetrical, with a distinctive flute, a channel carefully removed from each face of the point. This fluting was extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Many points broke during the process. Why did they do it? The flute may have facilitated hafting, attaching the point to a wooden spear shaft using snoo and natural adhesives. Clovis points have been found across North America, from Alaska to Mexico, from California to Florida. This widespread distribution in a relatively short time period suggests either rapid migration of Clovis people or transmission of their technology through trade and social networks. But the Clovis point was just one tool in their arsenal. Paleo-Indians used atlatls, spear throwers that worked like an extension of the arm, multiplying throwing force. With an atlatl, a skilled hunter could launch a spear over 100 yards with enough force to penetrate mammoth hide. Wooden spears, typically 6 to 8 feet long, were carefully balanced and could be used repeatedly if the point wasn't damaged. Beyond hunting weapons, survival demanded dozens of other tools. Scrapers for processing hides into leather, bone needles for sewing warm, weatherproof clothing, cutting tools for butchering, grinding stones for processing plant materials, fire starting kits that couldn't fail, containers fashioned from bark, hide, or woven plant fibers. Every tool was precious. A broken spear point at the wrong moment could mean a missed kill and hunger for the band. A lost fire-starting kid could mean death from exposure. So tools were carefully maintained, carried from camp to camp, repaired when possible, and replaced when necessary. The technology was simple, but the knowledge behind it was anything but.
What was daily life actually like for these Ice Age pioneers? Forget the dramatic mammoth hunts for a moment. Most days weren't spent facing down giants. They were spent in the routine work of survival, work that was no less demanding for being routine. Life followed the seasons in an endless cycle. In summer, when resources were abundant and dispersed across the landscape, bands might split into smaller family groups. A few families here, following a caribou herd, another group there, fishing at a productive river. This fission-fusion pattern allowed them to exploit scattered resources without depleting them. But as winter approached and the land became harsh and unforgiving, they would gather again, larger groups at established locations where the new resources could sustain them. River valleys where fish still swam under the ice, natural rock shelters that provided protection from howling winds, locations where game animals gathered. Camp itself was a temporary affair, rarely occupied for more than a few weeks. In the treeless expanses of Ice Age North America, shelter materials were precious. Archaeological evidence from Siberia shows us what Paleo-Indian shelters might have looked like. Frame marks of mammoth bones and tusks covered with mammoth hides. The bones, too heavy for predators to scatter, remained where camps once stood, silent testimony to human ingenuity. Where wood was available, they built frameworks covered with hide. And when they found caves or rock overhangs, they used them gratefully, leaving behind the stone tools and fire-cracked rocks we find today. Every camp had to meet certain requirements. Proximity to water, of course, life couldn't exist without it, but also protection from wind, visibility to spot approaching danger or game, and access to the resources they needed. Within the camp, there were specific activity areas, tool-making zones scattered with stone flakes and discarded pieces, food processing areas, places for waste disposal, kept downwind and distant from living spaces. Food. Everything revolved around food. Yes, they hunted large game when opportunity arose. A mammoth kill could feed the band for months. But day to day, their diet was remarkably diverse. Women, often accompanied by children, gathered plant foods, seeds, nuts, roots, berries, each in its season. They understood which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, which were poisonous. They hunted small game, rabbits, ground squirrels, birds. They fished with spears, nets, and traps. And crucially, they knew how to preserve food, smoking meat over fires, drying it in the sun and wind. In winter, the cold itself was a refrigerator. Evidence suggests they even understood fermentation. Clothing meant the difference between life and death. Based on ethnographic parallels with Arctic peoples, Paleo-Indians likely wore multiple layers. An inner layer of soft, tanned hides or furs against the skin for warmth, an outer layer of wind-resistant hide, mittens, boots, stuffed with dried grass for insulation, and head coverings, everything sewn with bone needles using sinew thread. A full set of winter clothing might require the hides of a dozen animals. And clothing wore out, constantly needing repair or replacement. Fire. We take it for granted, flicking a lighter or striking a match. For Paleo-Indians, fire was life itself. Warmth in the bone-chilling cold. Cooking that made food safer and more digestible. Light against the long darkness of winter nights. Protection from predators that feared the flames. Heat for treating stone to improve napping. The social center where the band gathered, told stories, made plans. Losing fire could doom a band, so fire-making knowledge was critical, practiced until it became second nature. They used friction methods, fire drills and fire bows, or struck certain stones to create sparks. And when moving camp, they carried embers in special containers, protecting them like the precious resource they were.
Humans are more than survival machines. Even in the harshest conditions, we create culture, meaning, beauty. The Paleo-Indians were no exception. Their society was built on kinship, knowledge, and connection. The family band was everything, typically 25 to 50 people, all related by blood or marriage. Grandparents and grandchildren, brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins. In a mobile hunter-gatherer society, groups larger than this couldn't be sustained. There simply weren't enough resources to feed more mouths. Groups smaller than this were vulnerable. Not enough hunters for successful game drives. Not enough people for all the work of survival. Not enough genetic diversity. In this society, without writing, without books, without any way to record information except in human memory, the elders were living libraries. They carried knowledge accumulated over lifetimes. Where water could be found in drought years, which plants bloomed first in spring, how to read animal tracks days old, the seasonal movements of game, stories of successful hunts and near disasters, how to make fire when everything was wet,
how to treat injuries with plant medicines. All of this passed down orally, through demonstration, through story. Children learned by watching and doing. A 5-year-old might help gather firewood or collect berries. A 10-year-old could process small hides or help with fishing. By adolescence, young people accompanied adults on hunts and gathering expeditions, gradually assuming adult responsibilities. There were no schools, no formal education, just the constant, ongoing transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. The death of an elder wasn't just a personal loss, it was the loss of irreplaceable knowledge. Though direct evidence is limited, we can be virtually certain that Paleo-Indians had rich spiritual lives. All human societies do. They surely buried their dead with care, suggesting belief in an afterlife. They created art. We've found carved bone tools with decorative elements, pigments like ochre that suggest body painting or other artistic use. They told stories, origin stories about where they came from, stories about the animals they hunted, stories that explained their world. They likely had shamans or spiritual leaders who mediated between the human world and the spirit world. They conducted ceremonies, perhaps before major hunts, perhaps at seasonal transitions, perhaps to mark life events like births, coming of age, marriages, and deaths. Their worldview likely emphasized harmony with nature. These weren't people who saw themselves as separate from or superior to the natural world. They were part of it, dependent on it, respectful of it. The animals they hunted weren't just meat sources. They were beings worthy of respect, perhaps even reverence. But bands couldn't survive in isolation. With only 25 to 50 people, there weren't enough potential mates. Inbreeding would have been catastrophic within a few generations. So periodically, multiple bands would gather, perhaps at particularly rich resource locations, perhaps at traditional meeting places. These gatherings served multiple purposes. Young people met potential mates from other bands. Bands exchanged goods. A group with access to good stone for tools might trade with a group that had particularly fine hides. They shared information about game movements, weather patterns, successful hunting strategies. They conducted ceremonies together. They strengthened social bonds that extended across vast territories. These networks of interconnected bands explain something that puzzles archaeologists: how Clovis technology spread so rapidly across North America. It wasn't that Clovis people themselves spread everywhere. It was that the technology, the knowledge, spread through these social networks, passed from band to band, until it reached from coast to coast.
Once Paleo-Indians passed the ice sheets and entered the ice-free regions of North America, something remarkable happened. They spread across 2 continents with a speed unparalleled in human history. Consider this timeline. Humans entered Alaska around 16,000 to 15,000 years ago. By 14,500 years ago, less than 2,000 years later, they had reached Monteverde in Chile, over 10,000 miles to the south. This represents one of the fastest large-scale human migrations ever documented, from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America in less than 100 human generations. How did they move so fast? The Americas were a land of abundance, at least compared to Ice Age Beringia. As bands pushed southward and eastward, they encountered environments their ancestors had never experienced.
temperate forests thick with game, grasslands where bison herds numbered in the thousands, rivers teeming with fish, coastal areas rich with shellfish, desert regions with their own unique resources, tropical rainforests, high mountain valleys. Each environment was different. Each required new knowledge and strategies. Yet they adapted with remarkable flexibility. Coastal peoples developed sophisticated maritime technologies, boats, fishing gear, knowledge of ocean currents and tide patterns. Plains peoples specialized in hunting the great bison herds, developing the fulsome point specifically designed for these animals. Desert dwellers learned to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, to exploit desert plants that held moisture. Forest peoples became expert trackers, hunting deer and elk through dense vegetation. This adaptation led to diversification. The original Clovis culture, characterized by its distinctive fluted points, began to split into regional variants. By 11,000 years ago, we see fulsome points on the plains, different styles in the eastern woodlands, specialized coastal technologies. This was the beginning of the incredible diversity of indigenous American cultures that Europeans would encounter millennia later. Population grew explosively. Starting from perhaps just a few hundred initial migrants, population models suggest there could have been several million people in the Americas by 10,000 years ago. The absence of other humans meant no competition, no territorial conflicts, just vast lands to explore and settle. By 10,000 years ago, humans had settled every habitable region from the Arctic tundra to Tierra del Fuego. Then came isolation. Around 11,700 years ago, the Ice Age officially ended. Global temperatures rose, the great ice sheets melted, and the oceans rose with them, flooding Beringia beneath hundreds of feet of water. The land bridge that had allowed humans to reach the Americas disappeared. For the next 10,000 years, until European ships crossed the Atlantic, American indigenous peoples developed in isolation from the Old World. This isolation would have profound effects. While humans in Africa, Europe, and Asia continued to interact, share ideas, and develop interconnected civilizations, the Americas evolved independently. Different agricultural systems developed. Corn, beans, and squash rather than wheat, rice, and barley. Different animals were domesticated. Llamas rather than horses. Turkeys rather than chickens. Different technologies emerged. The wheel was never developed for transportation, though it appeared in toys. Different government systems evolved, from small bands to vast empires, like the Inca and Aztec. Different languages emerged, over 1,000 distinct languages by 1492. When Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he didn't encounter a new world, he encountered a very old world, one with 15,000 years of human history, one that had developed entirely independently of his own.
Why does this ancient migration matter today? Why should we care about events that happened 15,000 years ago? First, because this migration established humans in the Americas for the first time. Every indigenous person in North and South America, from the Inuit hunting seals in the Arctic to the Mapuche in Patagonia, from the Navajo of the American Southwest to the Yanomami of the Amazon, all descend from these original Paleo-Indian populations. This is their history, their ancestors, their story that extends back not decades or centuries, but 15,000 years. When Europeans arrived in 1492, they encountered what they called a new world. But there was nothing new about it. The Americas were home to an estimated 50 to 100 million people.
The Inca Empire in South America was larger than any European nation. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was larger than any European city of its time. The Iroquois Confederacy had a sophisticated democratic system that would later influence the American Constitution. From the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, complex societies, vast trade networks, advanced agricultural systems, magnificent architecture, sophisticated art and music, all of this grew from the seeds planted by those first Paleo-Indian pioneers. This history counters a dangerous myth, the myth of the empty wilderness, the idea that the Americas were largely unpopulated and undeveloped before Europeans arrived. This myth was used to justify colonization, to claim that Europeans were bringing civilization to an empty land. The truth is that the Americas had been continuously inhabited for 15,000 years, that hundreds of distinct cultures had developed, that the land had been shaped by human hands for millennia. Modern genetic studies confirm the continuity. When scientists compare DNA from ancient Paleo-Indian remains with DNA from contemporary indigenous Americans, they find clear connections. Despite centuries of colonization, disease epidemics that killed an estimated 90% of indigenous people, forced relocation, and systematic attempts to erase indigenous cultures, that genetic and cultural continuity persists. The languages spoken by indigenous peoples today, from Inuktitut in the Arctic to Quechua in the Andes, evolved from languages spoken by those ancient pioneers. Traditional knowledge about plants, animals, and landscapes represents information accumulated over hundreds of generations. Spiritual beliefs and practices, though evolved and changed, connect modern indigenous people to ancestors who walked beneath Ice Age stars. Yet much remains unknown. Organic materials, wood, hide, woven plant fibers, most artifacts of daily life rarely survive 12,000 years. Many early sites are now underwater, flooded when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Small population sizes mean limited archaeological evidence. Ice Age glaciers destroyed or buried many sites. But new discoveries continue. New excavation techniques, new scientific methods like ancient DNA analysis in carbon dating, new technologies like ground-penetrating radar, all are revealing more about this fascinating period. Just in recent decades, we've discovered pre-Clovis sites that pushed back the timeline. We've found evidence for coastal migration routes. We've gained new understanding of Ice Age environments. Understanding this migration provides crucial context. It challenges colonial narratives about American history. It demonstrates human resilience and adaptability in the face of impossible odds. It shows the deep roots of American indigenous cultures, roots that stretch back not hundreds, but thousands of generations. It reminds us that human history is always about migration, adaptation, and change. The Paleo-Indian migration was part of humanity's remarkable global expansion from Africa to every habitable continent. It was the final chapter in the story of how Homo sapiens became a truly global species. These ancient pioneers, armed with nothing but stone tools and accumulated knowledge, conquered the challenges of the Ice Age. They traversed 2 continents in less than 2,000 years, adapted to every environment imaginable, and established thriving populations that would eventually build civilizations rivaling any in the Old World. Their descendants would go on to develop sophisticated agriculture without draft animals. They would build pyramids without the wheel. They would create complex calendars and mathematical systems. They would establish empires that spanned thousands of miles. They would create art, literature, and music that continues to inspire. All of this developed independently from the Old World, proves the remarkable capacity of human innovation and adaptation. Today, indigenous peoples across the Americas maintain connections to these ancient ancestors. They preserve languages, traditions, and knowledge systems that are among the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. Their struggles for recognition, sovereignty, and cultural preservation are struggles to maintain a heritage that stretches back to the Ice Age. Understanding this deep history isn't just academic. It's essential for respecting Indigenous rights, understanding American history in its full context, and appreciating the incredible journey that brought humans to every corner of our planet. This story of the first Americans is ultimately a story about us, about human courage, ingenuity, and the relentless drive to explore, adapt, and survive. It reminds us that we are all descendants of migrants, all part of a single human family that has conquered every environment Earth has to offer. And it began with a handful of brave souls crossing a frozen land bridge, following the herds into an unknown world, armed with nothing but stone tools and hope.